Megan Rolf, and I'm an assistant professor of beef cattle management and a state beef extension specialist here at Oklahoma State University. Today, I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you a little bit about culling strategies during drought. We all know that when drought comes along, it really creates a situation where we have a challenging environment. So I just wanted to briefly overview a couple of these challenges because they do factor into the culling decisions we have to make during those times. The first of those I'm going to highlight today is heat stress, particularly when we have a drought that's occurring during the summer months. Heat stress can be addressed from a management standpoint, and interventions can be something as simple as making sure that they have access to shade in the form of trees, or even portable shade if they're in an area where there aren't any trees. Another mitigation strategy is making sure that they have plenty of available water, because water is one tool that animals can use to mitigate heat stress. There are also decision support tools to help you predict when heat stress will be an issue. One of those is the Cattle Comfort Advisor that we have available in Oklahoma. If you're not in Oklahoma, we also have, through a partnership between USDA and NOAA, a National Heat Stress Decision Support Tool. These decision support tools will allow you to plan management interventions before heat stress actually becomes an issue. One of the other main negative consequences of drought is a reduction in feed resources. When that occurs, you have two basic options: either deal with what you have, which factors into the culling and management decisions that you have to make, or try and supplement those feed resources by buying and bringing in forage resources from outside your area. One of the main questions that should be asked when you're trying to decide whether you need to cull or whether you're willing to buy some of those feed resources and import them is whether you have costly genetic resources that would be impractical or prohibitively expensive to replace. And if you think the answer to that question is yes, you may think about buying and bringing in some of those feed resources. If you don't, that may make your culling decision a little bit easier. The second question is, of course, if you decide you need to buy those feed resources and bring them in, can you find the available feed resources to purchase, and is it going to be affordable enough that you can pay for that from a financial standpoint? And of course, one drought issue that we don't often think enough about that sometimes becomes the biggest issue is a reduction in water resources. Reduction in water availability can occur not only due to a lack of rainfall, but also because of evaporation. We can also see reductions in water quality, which can increase adulterants and cause lower palatability of water, which can decrease water intake. As I mentioned before, this factors into the risk of heat stress. Drought can also result in increased frequency of blue-green algae growth in ponds and other water resources, which can be a huge issue that requires immediate intervention. One little conservation tip is that as the temperature of the water increases, water demand typically increases. So if you can shade your water, that can be a great way to conserve water during drought. If we are going to think about planning for a drought, we need to think about strategies to accomplish that goal and leave us in a good financial position both before and after the drought. These decisions can be related to a variety of things. They can include things like fitting animals to the environment, by which I mean that we really want to keep an eye on genetic optimums rather than maximums for some traits that impact carrying capacity and productivity. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. If you take a look at this graph, you can see that I generated a graph using the Angus Optimal Milk Module. This is the decision support tool that helps define an optimum level of milk EPD on which to make selection decisions. In defining the parameters for the module, I noted that we had highly variable feed resources that were fairly expensive. And what you can see pretty clearly from the graph is that milk production potential is one of those traits where we really want to search for an optimum rather than a maximum. If we get too far above the optimum or too far below the optimum, we have a negative impact on net income per cow. One of the other things that we can do is be conscious of our forage and other natural resources like water and adjust our stocking rates accordingly. By that I mean that we don't want to overstock and get ahead of the resources we have available, and if you need to cull to make sure that that ratio works, that's perfectly fine. We also don't want to restock too soon during drought recovery process before those forages have had a chance to recover. One other drought planning strategy is to have a flexible operation. You may want to consider multi-species grazing or having stockers and a cow herd because those stockers can be the first line of defense when culling. If we're selling stockers and not our cows, which really form the basis of the genetic resources in our herd, that can be a less painful culling decision than if we're having to cull those cows that we've invested a lot of time and resources into. As you can see, some of these strategies fall into shorter term options and longer term options. In the short term, I have feed and water supplementation listed as a mitigation strategy. However, it's possible that over the long term, that's not going to be a very viable strategy from a financial standpoint. So we really need to think more closely about taking advantage of the culling options that are available to us. We tend to think of culling as an agricultural dirty word, but culling isn't always a negative thing. Sometimes it can help us really improve the genetic basis of our herds. So if you're going to consider culling, the first step you want to have is a culling plan. When we think about a culling plan, it makes sense to really strategize beforehand because you don't necessarily want to be making these decisions right in the heat of the drought. You can plan ahead and make some of these decisions beforehand so that if drought does occur, you have a strategy in place and you know how you're going to handle that situation. The easiest thing to do is really start with the most obvious issues when making culling decisions. One of those would be if we have open cows. Those are the cows that are a pretty easy decision to cull and can be the first set of animals that leave the herd. When trying to identify open cows, one thing we can do is rather than waiting until later in the breeding season to check those cows and see if they're open, we can check them earlier in the breeding season. Then, as soon as you find out that they're open, you don't need to keep them any longer, and they won't be utilizing forage and water resources any longer than absolutely necessary. The second easy culling decision is culling any animals that are unsound. This slide includes a foot scoring system that looks at characteristics of the claw and also the angle of the foot. In these two systems, the middle values, which would be those 5s, are going to be your most favorable conformations. Anything to the left or right of that, particularly when you get to the far outside edges and those extremes, would be candidates for culling. Other obvious culling decisions can include older cows that maybe are missing teeth, particularly those that have bad udder quality. This slide shows an udder quality scoring system that's available, and you can see it ranges from udders that are very good in structure towards the top, towards those at the bottom that would be candidates for culling because they have balloon-shaped teats or really pendulous udders that have a broken floor. Older cows in general may be on the culling list if you're through the most obvious problem animals and still need to cull additional animals to match the resources that you have available. You may be better off to keep those younger cows. They're not only your youngest in terms of years of future productivity, they're your most recent genetics. Those are the cows that we can expect to be around for a little bit longer, so you may be willing to invest more of your resources in those younger cows than the older cows. When we talk about culling, we typically talk about the cows a lot because we have more cows than we do bulls, but I think it's worth mentioning that we don't want to entirely forget about the bulls. If you have cows that are bred, they're at least out doing something during that time because they're out there gestating a calf. But after the cows are bred, the bull is really not doing a lot of work for you during that time. So if you happen to have a bull that you really don't intend to keep, or maybe he's been around for quite a few years, you may want to think about culling him immediately after the breeding season, and then not purchasing another bull until you need him for the next breeding season. Once the obvious culling choices have been made, and the most obvious animals have been sold, the choices tend to get a little bit tougher. But this is a time when your production records can really come in handy because probably the next category of animals that need to be examined are those that are the least productive. So those could be the cows that wean small calves for their size, or they may be cows that calve late in the season. They could also be those animals that are very extreme. So anything that is extreme in milk or mature size or other traits like those where optimums are really better than maximums would be the next category of animals that you may consider culling. Another thing to think about in terms of this discussion is whether you want to center some of your culling decisions on heifers versus mature cows. And there are some advantages and disadvantages of either of those approaches. If you focus on keeping your heifers and culling more of your cows, this can be advantageous because your heifers are your newest genetics and your feed requirements may be a little bit lower than some of those mature cows. However, focusing on keeping the cows can also be advantageous because those animals are already in production, whereas you're going to have to wait a little bit longer to get a calf on the ground with a heifer. The focus on heifers or cows will be for each individual producer to decide, but it is something to think about in terms of your culling priorities and your culling strategies. There are culling systems that have been developed, and one of these systems that available was developed by Jim Gosey. This system assumes that open cows are culled first, but it's essentially a bad marks system. In this system, you go through and you give bad marks to cows that have calving difficulties, cows that calve late in the season, cows that don't wean a calf or that wean a very light calf with poor performance, cows that have big teats or poor udder structure, and cows with bad temperaments. So when you go through, you can start by culling those animals which have the largest number of bad marks and trying to maintain those animals in your herd that maybe don't have a very large number of bad marks or don't have any bad marks at all. There are also some management options available that relate back to culling, and one of those is early weaning. The idea behind early weaning is that it's more economical to feed the calf directly than feed it through the cow because milk production is an expensive biological process. You can save cow feed costs when you remove that lactation energy demand. You can either wean those calves early and feed them and maintain both the cows and the calves separately, or you can early wean those calves and cull those cows or sell those calves a little bit faster. This strategy frees up some of those forage resources for the remaining cows, and then you're feeding those calves separately in the most efficient and economical way possible. If you choose to do really early weaning, you do need to have concentrate feed available for those animals. When we get to approximately 300 pounds or greater, that's where we can start thinking about having a more forage-based diet with less concentrate available to those animals. I know this may sound a little bit cliche, but I referenced it at the beginning of the presentation, and I really believe it's true, that some of the challenges related to drought and the need to cull can be an opportunity in disguise, provided that we have a logical plan to deal with these hardships in place before they occur. It's obviously not something that anybody likes to have to do, but there can be some benefits that come from culling. When we have to do extensive culling, we do tend to end up with the most superior animals from a production standpoint, and also migrate towards having a younger herd when we get done with that culling process. Additionally, if you're keeping replacement heifers when you start to rebuild the herd, you're really keeping replacements from the best animals that you have, which really can be an asset, especially from a genetics perspective. Also, when you're restocking, you do have an opportunity to bring in new genetics. You can make a lot of genetic improvement in your herd very quickly if you purchase some high-quality replacement females from a reputable supplier throughout that restocking process. If we go through and cull those females that calve late in the breeding season, you can tighten up your calving season, which has some management benefits when it comes to calving them out, and also economic benefits when you go to sell larger lots of calves. You also have a chance to reevaluate practices that just aren't working and make adjustments to those during this whole process. I hope that this presentation outlined some good strategies to think about when planning ahead for drought. Taking the time to make a drought culling plan can make those management and culling decisions a lot easier and make us more likely to survive those hard times and come out on the other side with an even better herd. Thanks very much.